the New York Post. Biden quietly sells off border wall parts to thwart GOP push to use them. The Biden administration is quietly auctioning off millions of dollars worth of unused parts from former President Trump's border wall for peanuts in an apparent end run around pending legislation in Congress. Since April, GovPlanet, an online auction house specializing in military surplus, has sold 81 lots of steel square structural tubes intended for use as vertical boards in the border barrier's 30-foot tall panels, hauling in about $2 million. On Tuesday, GovPlanet netted $154,200 for 729 of the 28-foot tall hollow beams sold in 5 separate lots for an average of $212 apiece. 13 more lots are set to be auctioned on August 23rd and August 30th. But last month, as part of its annual defense appropriations package, the Democrat led Senate passed a Republican sponsored bill aimed at forcing Biden to stem the worsening migrant crisis at the U.S. Mexico border by extending the wall. You can see some of the photos there of the materials itself. Up to $300 million worth of taxpayer funded wall components have been left to rust since Biden came to office, Republicans said. The Finish It Act will make the feds use those materials on new wall construction or hand the remaining stock over to the states like Texas for use in their own border defense projects. Now the Biden administration is rushing to get rid of the wall leftovers before the GOP-led House can pass a matching version of the bill and make it law. And then you can just see there's a few reactions from different senators there. So we'll go ahead and skip that portion for now. But unfortunately, this is not something that shocked me. It's refreshing to actually see that the Senate was actually going to pass a bill that was hopefully going to actually do something about the border crisis. My guess, I didn't actually see who voted on the bill, and chat, feel free to check in on this, or Michael, Mark, if either of you know. But I'm assuming that the reason why the bill passed the Senate in the first place is probably from senators in some of these purple states, like Arizona, probably Kristen Sinema, maybe Joe Manchin, a couple of places like that, probably voted for this because there is I'm not going to say that there's sane Democrats in the U.S. Senate necessarily, because at the statewide level, that's a rare find. But I will say that there are individuals who are definitely going to look out for their political interests, and the border security issue is definitely an issue that is becoming harder and harder for them to sweep under the rug. But Mark, I'm going to turn it to you because obviously this is your field. And so you know a lot more about this. So I'd love your initial reaction.
I have seen some of this stuff stacked up. In fact, I was driving in New Mexico on the way to El Paso. I was driving from Tucson to El Paso, and there's the highway. It's a 2-lane highway, a state highway, number 9, so New Mexico 9, and it goes parallel to the border, but at one point it bows down right near the border. And I was figuring, okay, I looked at it on a map. I said, okay, I'm going to pull over here, see if I can get up close to the border wall. I've seen it a million times. I hadn't seen it there, though. So lo and behold, there's a little access dirt road there. So I said, oh, great. I pulled in, and there were thousands of these wall units just stacked up, sitting there. In other words, it was a place where the construction companies were before Biden took over. They were stacking them there and then using them and taking them to wherever they were going to use them. Thousands of them just sitting there, stacked up on the ground. It was like something almost like an art installation. I mean, it was, because I even took pictures of myself walking from in between them and pictures through the tubes, And anyway, Biden is actually costing enormous amounts of money by canceling these contracts. And what they're trying to do here, what they'll say is, well, we're trying to recoup some of the cost. But the New York Post story is right. They're trying to get this stuff out so that they won't be forced to give it to Texas or build it themselves. There's a place in Arizona called the Yuma Gap, where they were building wall, but when Biden took over, literally on the afternoon that he was sworn in as president, he put out an order saying, put down your tools and step away from a construction, stop doing it. And so there's these gaps in the walls, just openings. And 2.5 years after he took over, they said, well, maybe we'll plug some of these little holes that are left, incidentally. Well, I went once and then I went again several months later. They had done a little site work on one of the smallest gaps. They hadn't done anything. They were slow walking it. So what it boils down to is this administration specifically sees the wall as something that they hate and won't do. But in more generally, they don't think the American people have the right to keep anybody out. They think that if somebody foreigner walks up to our border and has some kind of story of woe, which frankly, most of the countries that people come from have problems. Nobody's moving here from, or not many people are moving here from, Denmark. Right. So basically they're saying, look, we don't have any right to keep these people out. And a wall is symbolically, both practically and symbolically, an assertion that, yes, we do have borders and no, you can't come in just because you want to. And because of that, again, both practical reasons and symbolic reasons, this administration is not going to go for it. And this gambit of theirs was actually kind of clever. You had said you weren't surprised. You were, dismayed but not surprised. I was a little bit surprised because it's a little more imaginative than I thought these guys would be. In other words, they're basically rushing to get this stuff into somebody else's hands. So God forbid Texas doesn't get it and build the border wall themselves, because there are sections of wall that Texas is building on its own. They get permission from private landowners and they just build it themselves.
Well, bureaucrats only work on weekends if they got something more important to cover up. So unfortunately, it seems you're right about them rushing this.
There's two things that stick out to me about this. And the first is that it doesn't seem like just the most petty thing. It's not enough to leave well enough alone. They've got to kind of sneak it around and make sure it doesn't happen, even if you're going to do it on your own dime. And that's the other thing that comes to mind for me when I read this is, what is money? Money is such a non-factor, and a imaginary factor for a lot of the people making these decisions. And yet our entire culture and the people in the lower middle class that are suffering the greatest because of the decisions that are being made are tilling their lives away for money. And here we have billions of dollars of materials that, for one, are just being wasted, sitting out there rotting and rusting away, but also not just to waste them, but then to take them and just sell them to someone else, and not even for a fair price. We're not getting money back to the government. That's not what it's about. It's just getting rid of the resources that could have been used for an agenda of the big bad orange man.
Well, you know what they say in Washington, a trillion here, a trillion there, sooner or later it adds up to real money.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, to your point, Michael, money does not seem to be a big thing that politicians in DC are concerned about saving up. But if you are in Hawaii, of course, you can get a $700 check per family, but we're up to about 140 billion or so to Ukraine at this point. So unfortunately, it really boils down to their ideology. These individuals who are in charge of these institutions and making these decisions, whether that be the Biden administration or some of these senators that we have at Washington or the bureaucratic state, they really treat America like it's a colony, not a nation. And that mindset is huge because we can see where, they treat us sometimes just as good, most times worse than places like Ukraine, other places that they're trying to either colonize or have their own little pet projects in. And unfortunately, that's just the reality that, Hawaii has its worst fire that it's seen in hundreds of years. And yet Babylon Bee had a good article that said plane flying aid for Ukraine flies over Hawaii or something like that. And it's just, unfortunately, that's just the reality. But Mark, maybe you could talk a little bit more to that point about how the ruling class tends to view the the United States more as a colony as opposed to a nation.
I think that's actually a really good way to put it. I never really thought of it specifically in that way, but clearly the source of a lot of the problems you see in immigration, but in a lot of areas actually, is that our leadership class, and it's not just government, it's, business leaders, academic, media leaders, frankly, a lot of religious leaders too, you see it in all kinds of areas, are really disconnected from the interests of the people at large. It's not so much that they're anti-American, although some of them clearly are, but it's that the way I think of it is that they're post-American. In other words, America's just sort of a place, and they may even like it okay, but it's not their job is not to represent and promote the interests of the American people. I remember years ago, I gave a talk at the Council on Foreign Relations. Yes, I was invited to talk. This is many years ago. And a guy who was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations came down from New York. He was a vice president of Citibank. So right there, we got Citibank and the Council on Foreign Relations, sort of a twofer. If you were part of the Trilateral Commission, then it would be all over. But anyway, so this guy said after my talk, he said, a lot of the stuff you say makes sense. It's probably true that a lot of Americans are impacted adversely by immigration. But, I don't have any more responsibility to somebody in, Bed-Stuy, New York than I do to somebody in, Kathmandu, Nepal. In other words, he'd moved beyond America in his thinking. And okay, that's fine. But our leadership classes, our elites, how can you have a country led by people who don't see the interests of the country that they're supposedly leading as their job? I mean, that's what that whole rich men north of Richmond thing is about, is that I think the way you put it is a good way to put it, is that sort of we're a colony of Washington, D.C. The rest of the country is. And, we need decolonization and, self-determination, as it were, independence. And I mean, that's obviously what the whole Trump phenomenon is about, whatever his, many manifold shortcomings are. That's why he resonates with people.
Absolutely.
Because people see him as concerned about their interests, whether that's actually true or not, it's a different question. And he's pushing back against people who, frankly, consider them deplorable. I mean, that's in my opinion, that's the core problem in our politics. Immigration is one of the places you really see it most obviously, but you see it in all kinds of other places as well, I think.